Hi, y'all. If you are just joining us, again, I do apologize for our technical difficulties, but welcome to Decoding the Past, Conversations with PC Innovators. I do think it's time for us to get started. So welcome again. Decoding the Past is an ongoing speaker series of the Paul Gray Personal Computer Museum at Claremont Graduate University. My name is Bailey Westerhoff, and I'm a PhD student in Cultural and Museum Studies here at CGU, and I'm also the Executive Director of the Paul Gray Personal Computing Museum. For today's session, The Future of Democracy in the Digital Age, we are excited to host a conversation with our guest, Gregg Zachary, former Wall Street Journal chief writer on Silicon Valley, and author of the article, Digital Manipulation and the Future of Electoral Democracy in the US, as well as our moderator, Karen Wickre, author and longtime observer of corporate culture and the internet. I'd love to start today by sharing a brief background on the Paul Gray Personal Computing Museum. The museum's founder, Paul Gray, arrived at Claremont Graduate University in 1983 to establish the Center for Information Systems and Technology, better known today as CISAT. While founding CISAT here at CGU, Professor Gray also began amassing a collection of personal computers. His collection focused on tracking the changes in computer technology with an eye for impacts on user relationships. Professor Gray was fascinated with the impact that personal computing was having on people's lives and the individualized relationships with technology that were emerging. After an 18-year career at CGU, teaching hundreds of students, Gray retired in 2001 and founded the Paul Gray Personal Computing Museum. And as part of his legacy, he donated his collection to CGU with the hopes that friends, colleagues, and students would build upon his work in the museum. Now today, the museum traces the innovative history of personal computing over the last 50 years, always with Paul Gray's original purpose in mind: for you to see and contemplate how computers affect your life. Now, thanks to the transdisciplinary collaboration between CISAT and the School of Arts and Humanities, the museum continues to flourish by developing new partnerships, resources, and programming like today's Decoding the Past. Since our first Decoding the Past event in 2020, the museum is proud to have hosted incredible visionaries in the field, including Jack Niles, internationally known as the father of teleworking and telecommuting, Dan Bricklin, inventor of VisiCalc, the first electronic spreadsheet, Adele Goldberg, who co-developed the programming language SmartTalk 80 at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, Walt Mossberg, veteran technology columnist, commentator, and conference producer, Marie Claway, president of Harvey Mudd College and renowned computer scientist and scholar, Harry McCracken, editor of Fast & Company, and most recently, Benj Edwards, AI and technology journalist. You can learn more about these events and watch the recordings on our website, which I will post in our chat. So I'm posting it in our chat now. Now, if you follow that link, you'll also see an option to donate to the museum on the right of the page. If you are able, I'd really like to encourage you to consider a donation of any amount. Donations help ensure the continued success of the museum and events like Decoding the Past, while providing CGU students like myself with an amazing opportunity for professional growth. Okay, I promise those are all of my plugs for now. Let's get to the main event. The museum is so excited about the opportunity to explore the pertinent topic of democracy in the digital age and discuss our current world and the hope for a more secure future. So on behalf of the museum, I am pleased to introduce our moderator, Karen Wickre. Karen Wickre is a veteran connector, editor, and communicator based out of Silicon Valley. As a corporate writer, Karen developed stories, styles, and cadence for Google, Twitter, and many other startups. More recently, she has served as an advisor for a range of companies, developing strategies for their messaging and the content they produce. A strong supporter of journalists and journalism, Karen serves on the board of the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowships at Stanford and the News Literacy Project. In 2008, she published her book, Taking the Work Out of Networking, An Introvert's Guide to Making Connections That Count. And that's just the short list. So I want to thank you, Karen, for joining us today and for all the work you've put into this event. Now, just a reminder, Karen will begin our conversation with Gregg Zachary. Then about 40 minutes in or so, we will open that conversation to the audience for questions and answers. So please feel free to use the chat function throughout the conversation. And if you have any questions at any time, you can use them again. You can enter them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I will pass the mic to Karen and Gregg.
Thank you so much, Bailey. Thank you for having us today. And I'm very excited about this conversation because not only is it a super hot topic we're going to be delving into, but I can't think of anyone better than Gregg to help us delve. Right, we're talking about big ideas and big concepts here. So, Gregg, I think you wanted to sort of lay the foundation for the subject and what we're going to talk about today. Do you want to start with that?
Thanks, Karen. And I'll do that briefly. By the way, I want to thank also Paul Gray Museum and Claremont for having me, and point out that my writing name, where you'll find all my writings and my website, is G. Pascal Zachary. I wish I was named after a computer language, but my parents were not that visionary. I was named after apparently the French mathematician. So I just want to say a few words to try to frame the conversation. First, I don't like the term fake news because fake news is not fake, it's real. I'd rather talk about the problem of unreliable information because we all have had the experience of what we might think of as useful fictions, stories, and sometimes parables or tales that help us find our way through the world. So the effects of digital disinformation is hard to quantify, and that is a given that is stubborn. Voting behavior is notoriously difficult for scholars and politicians alike to understand. So even the effect of fake news or unreliable information on the web is difficult to assess. And especially since there are useful fictions. When Joe Biden says in a State of the Union address the other day that America is stronger than ever, that might be a useful fiction to exhort us to feel better about our difficult circumstances. So simply banning all factually false information, that's never going to work because of much of our communications aspirational. Then second, we're in the difficult situation where we have a moving target. Emerging digital technologies are going to make the problem of identifying fabrications and unreliable information in general much more difficult. And so when we look today at our responses, we might think of a technical fix, some kind of silver bullet that solves the problem. Oh, it's a certain software program that just stops it all, and then we're all happy ever after. These technical fixes are like seat belts. For the longest time, people complained about injuries in auto accidents, and then seat belts and airbags came along. So maybe we need an airbag for unreliable information. Second, I just want to mention that there are different kinds of speech, different kinds of information. in that we have to distinguish between them. And for people who might be called First Amendment absolutists, who believe that no abridgment of speech is possible or desirable, they must at least accept that libertarianism has been abridged in the United States in a number of ways. The Food and Drug Administration and the medical community manage information about medicine and disease and pharmaceuticals already. They manage it through civil law and through regulation. The SEC manages information about what companies can say about the health of their companies and their future prospects. These are hard and fast rules. Advertising, to some extent, is subject to constraints on speech. So there's nothing un-American about constraining speech. And also, there are norms. I grew up at a time when cursing, saying bad words, I could spell them out and not say them, but I won't do that. I think you know what they are. One of them starts with F. Well, now those were banned. You couldn't say those things on TV or radio, and now they're everywhere. So norms may play a role we may need to move towards new norms. But no question that escaping a race to the bottom, where with each passing year, our communications and our information sources are further adulterated by fakes, remains front and center to a lot of people. That's pretty much how I want to frame things, but especially important that commercial speech is already subject to regulation, and much speech is commercial. Elon Musk, for instance, insists Twitter is not public speech, it's private speech, and he can decide what is permissible. And mostly our law does follow that idea. If you own something, it's yours. So at any rate, we're interested in talking with Karen, who I know for many years and whose perspicacity on matters of social media and digital life is unrivaled. And I'm just pleased as punch to speak with her. I'll just say one last thing. If you're wondering, why am I wearing this? Because that's what my head looks like. I mean, it's cold in Northern California. We have a cold spell. And when you have, I think technically the term is no hair, you have to wear a hat. So from time to time, I'll put the hat on. It doesn't have any religious significance. Trust me on that. But it does keep my head warm. And I'm grateful. So Karen, thank you for this chance to chat.
Yeah, of course. And I think the hat looks great. You're good with it on or off. I wanted to get into something I think everybody got when they signed up or they had the chance to look at it, which is the recent paper article you wrote on unreliable digital information and the effects on voter behavior. You touched on this in the beginning, but talk about the direct connection between democracy and digital information. That's where the rubber meets the road, right? So can you summarize your line of thinking in that article and where you think things are now? Because it's a year, you wrote it recently, but things may have even changed / gotten worse since you wrote it.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Well, I think that my position is we need a societal response. We can't do nothing. So that at a federal level, the immunity that platforms like Google and Twitter and Facebook receive, meaning they cannot be sued for anything they put over their platform, we need to revisit that. And there are members of Congress that want to revisit that, but even the Democrats have not yet had the bravery to address that. So the question of what should we do is secondary now to how should we do anything? Because right now we have a complete laissez-faire environment. We don't treat the digital communications, digital media, the way we do radio, television, movies. Those systems have at least voluntary codes. The movie
Guardrails.
industry, what's that, Karen?
Guardrails. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the movies sort of have this system of rating their movies and giving some guidance to people about what's appropriate. So the first thing is, will the courts, in the absence of action, will the courts take action? The Supreme Court has a number of cases that have come before it, and they are either going to deliberate on soon or have deliberated on, regarding whether what we might just technically call tort law, whether tort law applies to digital media companies and digital communications.
Mhm.
Right now, tort law doesn't, that you might say, full stop. It is very, very difficult for an aggrieved person to sue one of these companies and receive some kind of compensation or account through the courts. Now, in Europe, by contrast, Western Europe, which isn't all that different from the United States, one successful intervention has been the right to forget provision that has allowed certain people who feel continually harmed by something old about them on the web. I'm fortunate, by the way, as an aside, all the bad things I did were before the web and before digital video and audio, because there's no record of them. It's just, it's amazing. But for younger people, that's not the case. Yeah. And they should be allowed in Europe to ask companies to take down material. So we're in an environment that's heterodox, meaning there's a set of rules in the United States that basically say you can do whatever you want. But in Europe, the very same companies who say they can't live with some rules or
yeah, they are living with those.
They're living with them in Europe.
Yeah.
And now, I mean, Europe is different in the sense that if we look at smoking and the kind of damage awards that smokers received from cigarette companies, the size of these awards is something unique to the United States. Europe won't allow these giant awards for civil damages. So their courts are more moderate in the way they'll assist individuals. In any case, we're either on the verge of seeing changes in our national laws or not, because it turns out that the far right, and that's basically the Republicans in Congress, and the far left, or just the left liberal coalition, which would be Adam Schiff, Bernie, Chuck Schumer, they are seriously interested. Ron Wyden in Oregon, the senator, they're seriously interested in, isn't there something we can do? Especially for flagrant abuses like live streaming of crimes. Mm-hmm. Now, very clearly, streaming tools have benefits. I know because we're on Zoom. This is an open platform that allows me to reach you. But if my wife walked in and greeted me by throwing a knife at my head, I think people would be pretty upset and would say that's not appropriate, okay? And we don't want that to happen again. So we in the absence of rules of the road that we can agree upon, there's a lot of confusion about what is acceptable or desirable. Unfortunately, within the political space, it's unlikely the national government, Congress, and the executive, or our courts, are going to set up a truth test for digital information, digital media. that is going to be the purview of members of society, of civil society. And I think civil society has had a number of interesting responses. Let's take the chatbot that just emerged, which is relevant to the extent that, let's say we found out that George Santos or some other member of Congress was using a chatbot to create their views on public affairs as opposed to expressing their own ideas. Now, we might be happy that they don't express their own ideas. The chatbots are probably more sensible, but we might consider that a misrepresentation. So Harvard and a group of elite universities, scores of them, have already said they are banning chatbots. Their students can't use them, and they're going to have signifiers that show them. So this gets us to the technological fix that maybe there are protections. We might call them prophylactics, information prophylactics, because we know, I mean, we wear masks because of COVID, we wear gloves. My wife is a healthcare worker. She has lots and lots of little gloves that she wears. So we might think of these as information gloves. That shouldn't make people move to New Hampshire and declare that they will not tolerate any interference. We're just saying certain information is toxic and we don't want it to circulate, and we'd like there to be protections. So we do see movements by civil society to do this. Now, that itself has polarizing potential. There's a lot of serious fighting going on between different actors we can see on campuses. I worked most recently 10 years at Arizona State University. I also taught at Stanford and Cal. And most universities today believe there should be some kind of guardrails for speech, some kind of controls or sanctions for saying things that are deemed inappropriate. Now, you can see this is problematic. On the other hand, most other societies do have these kind of softer rules. And you also see their frustration. We cannot have women, people of color attacked, as we see, especially women, seem to be subject to attacks on the web. It's hard to understand why these persist. But, one rule that I'll just finish with this, again, it's a technical fix, but Steve Ballmer, who I'm fond of because he's been humbled by owning the Los Angeles Clippers, and that was an important process for him to become a better person. But Steve Ballmer, who was the former CEO of Microsoft, has said, why don't we get rid of anonymity? Why don't we get rid of anonymity on the web? And I think that would do a lot towards solving the problem, because people then would at least own their statements. Of course, we may not have the technology that ensures that.
Yeah, I was going to say, as a former Twitter employee back in the day, I left there 7 years ago. But the argument on the other side of that, the using a real name, was for a different aspect of free speech, or unfettered speech, maybe we should say, which was when people are living in political hotspots or with oppressive governments, or are in some other kind of minority where revealing who they actually are, what their legal name is, would create problems for them, if not dangers. That's an argument, right, not to have anonymity. And it's something Twitter in its pre-Musk era really held to. Who knows what will happen now? But for that reason, there wasn't a requirement on Twitter to use and prove your name. But I want to go back to your examples about all the regulated industries. And it's true, movies, TV, advertising, all do have regulations, requirements, and limitations. But the big difference, I think, and the reason we've come to such a difficult point is that the platforms we're talking about largely, let's say YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and some of the smaller ones, they all have what is known in the trade as user-generated content, right? They're platforms of the people. And so that immediately makes it a lot harder to have requirements and limitations. And this is why this notion of a global town square seems to have come up. And in my era at Twitter, we actually we describe Twitter as a global town square. Now that we see now that's problematic. And in fact, there really can't be a single global town square. There can be a lot of them, perhaps, but they're all defined by just individual people, and then followed by organizations, and followed by bots, all sharing the same platform. And that is what's caused, I think, the proliferation of both useful real-time information and also lots of unreliable information, if not actively deceptive. So that seems to be, and we're in that, I mean, I think we're in a period now, we're not turning away from using social media in great numbers. We may switch platforms. We may, do other things or limit our time and so on. But we're not. It's like we're not. We want one-click order and delivery. We're not walking away from that either. So, given where we are now, I think that's part of it's caused part of the problem, and it's now the thing we have to wrestle with. So we can't regulate this sort of many-to-many speech the same way we could with one-to-many.
Well, I mean, you're right, Karen, but Ralph Nader in 1965 wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. It was about the auto deaths, which remain high. So one question is this unsafe at any speed? We get that the openness is a high requirement, but if openness is simply a mask for cynical deception, for relentless lying on the part of hidden actors who have taken control of these platforms, and worse, as we found with Facebook, that these cynical actors are generating advertising. ProPublica did a very, very sad example of how Facebook, despite having a Jewish CEO and a Jewish COO, was attracting a lot of advertising from anti-Semitic actors.
Yeah.
So the question becomes, just as with unsafe at any speed, if the level of mayhem and discontent caused by social media is so great, maybe you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So that's the problem for the techno-libertarians who continue to insist that harm done to others is simply impossible to stop. Well, that is not a successful answer, and it's not sustainable. Sooner or later, these platforms will reap what they've sown, and federal courts and state courts have only so much patience. The first large damage award, we're talking a multi-billion-dollar damage award in a class action suit against one of these companies, will cause an enormous change. And if it's something that we get to cry about, well, that's fine, we can cry. But we're not in a Garden of Eden. We're not in an information Garden of Eden. So if the companies have tools to reduce the incidence of these bad actions, which is actually very high, they need to use them more aggressively and at least prioritize them. So, with that said, though, I do agree that in American society that emphasizes freedom over responsibility. I worked 10 years in an open carry state. I never openly carried, but I was used to people walking around with guns. Our president had a rule that he was able to sustain, that students could not bring guns on campus. No one could bring guns on campus. Nevertheless, we have to strike a balance between freedom and accountability, but we're going to strike it in the US differently, and we're going to pay costs. Now, the CDC announced yesterday, I was a bit shocked, that 1 in 3 girls, meaning sub 18-year-old women, are somehow in deep distress some of the time. And we do see people pointing to social media for some of that increased sensitivity. These are difficult problems. And this is why I talk about norms being very important, Karen, because norms are practices that we agree to voluntarily and accept as a community. And I think a lot of people of goodwill have been trying very hard to spread a belief that norms will solve this problem rather than sanctions.
Right.
But the question to me is this sustainable? Because remember, in China, there's no open forum. Okay, that's 1.2 billion people. In India, where communal violence is very high, the pushback on social media has been pronounced. And Indonesia is a Muslim country, one of the largest. Nigeria, where my wife is from, one of the largest. These are not countries that have said, we subscribe to the American system. Oh no, Nigeria, you can go to jail for what you do online. Indonesia, you can go to jail for what you do online. People have been killed in Nigeria for things they've done online because crowds form and the society tolerates a certain amount of violence of this sort. So I think it's fine for Americans to say, we will pillage each other, we will destroy the fabric of our communities through uncontrolled digital communications, but the rest of the world is not going in this direction. Right. And so, what happened in New Zealand? Terrible live streaming. The New Zealanders immediately altered their laws, so this became impossible to happen again, or at least the penalties became very, very high.
Yeah.
So now it's a small country, and I think America's size is some of the issue. Also, the linguistic diversity of the United States is very high, so that, hey, something happens in Tagalog or Hindi or Arabic, and we've got to figure out what's going on about that too. This is really, really difficult. So, I'm not sanguine about the status quo continuing.
One of the glaring issues that I've seen is a pretty total lack of understanding on the part of, let's say, federal legislators and maybe some of the agencies, and maybe the general public, on the challenges of content moderation, especially, as you say, in other languages. This is one, I hesitate to say remedy, because we're far from remedies, but this is one area where companies could invest a lot more. Scale is a challenge, because the scale of the number of messages, posts, photos, videos flying through the air is just really it's not something humans can actually understand, the billions and billions, and you can't hire enough people to moderate to that degree. But you can have more robust content moderation. And one thing that is I've been struck by in the recent excitement and drama of the Musk era at Twitter is, for years, Twitter was criticized harshly for seeming to be very lax in terms of content moderation and having arcane rules that were not transparent for understanding what was allowed on or off. I'll grant you they were imperfect. I think they always will be imperfect, no matter which company is trying to do them. But in the more recent times, the Musk era, suddenly critics and, I would say, cultural commentators are observing, hey, Twitter actually had a pretty good system of content moderation and kind of thinking about what was allowed and not in a broader, somewhat more global way than
That's a
most.
very good point, and it's also suggests that there is some, running room. There is some advances that could be made, and I think that the Twitter experience under Musk is illustrative of the contrast, as you're saying, that Twitter beforehand did well in monitoring and taking down. But I do think that sooner or later, Karen, from a legal standpoint, as companies say they are responsible for X, then the litigation starts. You say, we're going to make sure X doesn't happen on our platform. And that's voluntary. We don't want to be held to that. But as soon as you proffer those protections, as soon as you present them to the public, they become almost legislative in that, well, now you've got the expectation that Twitter's protecting me, so I should be safe. So this dynamic cries out for a solution. Throughout history, oligopolies in the United States have begged for regulation because it takes off them certain burdens and it reduces uncertainty. And I think that the web is a different animal than trains and planes, but and it is more open and diverse. But I think a lot of companies would welcome some greater clarity from the federal government and courts about what are their obligations. And I think this has been the tricky part, because historically, newspapers, radio stations, television, their liabilities have actually been large. Their obligations have been pretty big. And so the companies don't want to go that far. But I do think that you might find the leading companies, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, accepting certain kinds of rules that would at least clarify for them what are their obligations, because you're right, you can't stop everything. And there are going to be things that leak through no matter what. So how might you do that? Now, the other thing that we now have seen is TikTok. What happens when a foreign power owns a social media platform? And so this is a new challenge, but it was sitting there all along. For all we know, Saudis really own Twitter, not Elon Musk. Elon Musk raised money, so who knows who really owns Twitter? And I think the TikTok, again, is helpful in the sense that it draws attention to these are businesses that are seeking to earn a profit. And so they are not, it's not a global public square. Now I would say this, Twitter did look a lot like that. And I think it was the closest to that we've seen. Mm-hmm. And that's why its sale to Musk, dramatically underscored that, no, this is a private business and somebody owns it. Mm-hmm. So, we are in a very difficult area. And I think because the United States faces so many challenges right now, this is not a high priority. Look how hard it is for the United States to identify the 3 objects shot down after the Chinese balloon was shot down. It's days.
Right.
So, come on. If it's so, pattern recognition, which is behind most of the monitoring schemes of unreliable information, it's not that easy. It's difficult because sometimes, as I'm saying, useful fictions. I believe in God. I think there needs to be expressions about the Bible. Well, is Noah's Ark true? Did Abraham really live to 1,000? Of course, those are not false claims, But you can see the problem when you try to set up a truth arbiter. And groups that do this fact checking, I'm not saying it's a complete waste of time, but I think it's misleading. Generally, one person's lies are another person's cherished beliefs. And so, we are just very polarized.
Yeah, we are. And so I was thinking as you were talking, we must get to the question of Section 230, where originally, well, you can explain this better than I can, but the notion behind it is that the telephone company is not a publisher because it's a carrier of private conversations, right, between people. So it's not responsible for what is said in those private conversations. Section 230 says there are certain entities that are carriers and not publishers. A number of the internet companies, the big internet companies, are using that point of view to say we're not responsible. We're carriers too. We have the platform, and what is said between and among people is subject to maybe other kinds of laws, plus the content moderation we can manage to put out there, but we can't possibly be responsible in the way that a publisher can, where they're controlled in a closed environment. So what should happen with Section 230?
Well, this argument around Section 230 is very difficult. President Biden has explicitly spoken about Section 230. Of course, he's supposed to be liberal. He's in favor of a lot of regulations. He says he can't decide what's best to do. So his administration has not offered any revisions to Section 230. No question, Section 230, meaning that Google and the others were able to be public forums by proxy, was enormously stimulative to the turning the web into a useful forum. So the question really is, has it outlived its value?
Mhm.
And second, what are the harms that people are suffering? Because I think some are not particularly manageable. They are something where the individuals themselves need to self-manage. If something is upsetting you, don't look at it. I mean, this sounds Pollyannish, but
Yes, I know.
that can't be lost. On the other hand, if there are specific harms, say to the reputation of a business because of reviews or things like that, there ought to be remedies, because now our first and sometimes our only way of learning about the world is through social media, search. And so coordinated attempts to mislead us probably have to be stopped. And if they can't be stopped by the carriers, who will stop them? A great example, actually, and it's great simply because few people would disagree, that photos of American soldiers being killed shouldn't be put on Google, shouldn't be put on Facebook, etc. And these companies have put in a lot of effort to make sure that those attempts to video of Americans dying are pulled down immediately or never make it on. The problem is that when you start to ask people in a democratic polity, what would you like to see that same treatment given?
Mhm.
You get a lot of answers. So people who don't like abortion would like all pro-abortion messages to be stricken. These people are promoting murder. How can you let them use your platform? So you start to see this is going to be very difficult.
Yeah.
And it may be that the courts in our country have to be the first line of defense, because if we think of product liability, which is a standard part of our law, it's very difficult to mount a product liability suit. let's take the Tesla navigation system or accents with Tesla cars. Hey, I mean, it's sad if anyone dies in a car crash, but establishing that a product is harmful or lethal usually requires years of evidence. And so I think there is something to learn from the product liability area. It's a very high bar, but yet there are constraints, and the specter of product liability suits force companies to monitor what they're doing much more than they might. But because some of the complaints about the social media are psychological and turn on values, it is different. Tylenol, poison Tylenol, hey, that has to be pulled from the shelves. And if you were unlucky enough to be harmed by a poison medicine, you might want it, your heirs might get redress. But what's it like if, you were misled into thinking that Saudi Arabia was a great place? I mean, what's the damage for that? It's just, these are really, or similarly with George Santos, okay, he misled people, but there is a remedy, which is to subject him to scrutiny and to defeat him at the next election, which is only 2 years. So we actually do have a pretty robust system of correction, but we are not using much of it with social media, and we could use more.
Bailey, here you are. Do you have questions?
I am. Well, you guys are having such a fascinating discussion. I want to thank you so much for all that you've shared so far, but I do want to make sure our attendees have a chance to kind of engage with you in this this dialogue you have going. So I do want to open up the conversation to the audience. Please feel free to submit questions either in the chat or in the Q&A function. I'm sure Greg and Karen would love to hear from you.
Do we need to be more inflammatory, Bailey? I would rather not, but
I think it's perfect. I
okay.
do have a friend with their hand up, so I'm going to allow them to ask you a question themselves.
Great.
Go ahead, Doctor. Oop. Dr. Vale, I think you have your hand up if you'd like to ask a question.
Yeah. Okay, now I'm available to speak. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Francisco Valle. I'm a graduate of the Drucker School, PhD in management.
Oh.
In 2015. The law is very clear. Section 230 and Section 1, C1, what it says, the non-provider or uses of information, should be liable, right, for any information provided by another information content provider.
Yes.
Right. However, we know that everybody uses, different information, to either augment it, right, or use it against somebody else. And on the other hand, in another section says, right, that no person, right, can just use information from somebody else, to abuse it. So there seems to be like a contradiction sometimes, and I'd like to know what is your opinion about this. And also, you mentioned, Greg, about language, right? What happens in another language? But I will also be interested to know more about what you think about cultural aspects, because, for instance, gossip runs faster along Hispanic, and some other ethnic groups than other ones, because we tend to rely less on real information and more on what my friend says. Mm-hmm. So what are your opinions? So you too, Karen, if you can comment about it. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Francisco, the problems you point to just suggest in a highly diverse country like ours, where diversity is our strength and is a bedrock of our American social life, the problems are more difficult than in, say, Norway, where Karen's ancestors are from, or say a country like Germany, where they've already accepted after World War II that there's a whole range of things you can't talk about at all, or even possess. These are Nazi memorabilia, etc. So this is just a very difficult problem. And also, as you say, the sensitivities of some groups to information is different. And so you're just pointing to, I think, the difficulty of Section 230. I will just say this, historically, the Digital Act in 1998, that Section 230 is part of, was meant to promote the web. At the same time, all web providers were exempt from tax. For many years, this assisted Amazon's rise greatly. And the strategy was, because it started with Democrats in the Clinton-Gore era, they wanted to incubate, they wanted to spread the web. They didn't want to hamper the web and content creation with too many restrictions. But now we have the most valuable companies in the world, the beneficiaries of this exemption. So the question to me is, do we normalize life for the social media and the digital information world or not? Because they get to play in a sandbox that's completely different than the pharmaceutical companies, than the retailers, than the banks. And, the crypto world is undergoing this right now. Hey, nobody wanted regulations for crypto. Well, they want them now. Okay, they want them now. Sam Bankman-Fried, he of so many names, he who never met a barber or knew how to dress. Oh, suddenly his dressing decisions are made by others. And he's also wearing an anklet. And I think his bail is something like $250 million. And he's in his parents' house in Palo Alto. And so the point is, those crypto people now are facing a world that isn't going to happen to the digital media companies, but it's an example of what can happen when you have no rules. Okay.
Yeah.
So, whatever the shortcomings are of 230, and you're right, it's a sledgehammer, it's a blanket exemption. How might we replace it with something that tries to respect the diversity of the United States, the traditions of open information, the acceptance of, to some extent, the Jeffersonian marketplace of ideas, that good ideas will drive out bad ones. It's the opposite of Gresham's law, okay? But we do see that some of the bad ideas can be propagated so cheaply, so widely, that we may wish to rethink that marketplace of ideas.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Greg. Now, we do have another question in the chat. We have a question. Do you feel the number of viable political parties has any bearing on the social impact of misinformation?
Karen, do you want to try that, or
There's,
I can? Because I think that person is very smart. That is a very shrewd insight.
it's a shrewd insight, and I would say there's a couple of key words in there that shout out to me. One is viable political party. And the question then went away, so now I can't reference it.
What to me is important about this is we do not have a parliamentary system. A parliamentary system, which is essentially all of Europe, allows what we might think of as fringe parties, or in colloquially, lunatics, to have their own political parties, to enter the civil space with a certain amount of dignity, and to see what kind of support they get. That's shut off in the US. We don't have Le Pen. We don't have a right-wing populist party. We don't have a woke party. That's what I would call it, the woke party. Yeah, yeah. We don't have a woke party that might get a third of the vote in California. Who knows? But would never win. So the point is that because we're stuck in a rigid binary political system where it's either them or us, 0 or 1, the ramifications of this are much greater, because if there was a parliamentary system, one wonders if people like Steve Bannon might be happy to be in Congress, and that might moderate their behavior, or at least make them feel like they're getting what they are deserved.
They have a place
In
at the
our
table.
system, fringe views are completely shut out of the political system, and it may increase the pressure on digital media because that's the one outlet. That's the only place we can express ourselves. I do believe that the parliamentary system is much better at managing the kind of spread and diversity of views that we now have in the US. I was born in 1955. Hey, when I was 10 years old, it seemed like everybody agreed on everything. Richard Nixon, the Republicans, thought the same things as the Democrats. I mean, it was very limited, the difference between the parties. And now we've gone to a different realm, and also clearly the primaries are acting now as much more important, because arguments within the parties, and all of this is consistent with minority views, fractional views getting traction because of the web. On a global scale, we've seen an enormous revival of lesser languages. Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, many African languages, just an enormous effort to give these languages voice in the digital forums. And that's been incredibly satisfying for people who never had, I mean, many countries, even France, banned minority languages on the radio. They were illegal. So we can see how much happiness has been generated by the proliferation on the web of minority languages and how robust these languages are. And so this system that we are, quote unquote, stuck with, the winner take all, may be part of the enabling social milieu that makes this harder for us to deal with than other countries. The narrowness of our elections, I mean, if Trump loses 1 to 2% of his base, he can't ever win again because his margin is so small. And we have never experienced such close elections. Michigan, Pennsylvania, big states, barely the election decides who is. I mean, look at the senator in Nevada. I mean, Nevada, okay? That senator, who is a Democrat, won by 1,000 votes. I mean, come on. So this is, again, puts pressure on the information system, because you have people seriously believing that, well, that misinformation cost me 400 votes. And you might say 400 votes, that's nothing, but that's the election. Didn't used to be that way. Didn't used to be that way. We used to have a pretty wide buffer of room for error, you might say, but we don't now. Does that person want to identify themselves so we can congratulate them, or?
Well, he is identified in the chat.
Okay, very good.
Bailey, how are we?
We're doing great. We do have another friend with their hand raised. One of our board members, Lauren Olfman, would like to raise a question. So Lauren, if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, I did. I must have pressed the wrong button by mistake. I'm enjoying the conversation, but I didn't have a question.
Oh,
Let brighter
perfect.
people than me ask.
That's okay. We've got a couple other questions, but good to see you, Lauren.
Yeah.
Um, so we do have a question in our chat. Can you talk more about Chat GPT?
Well, I think in general, what I'll say without preempting Karen is simply that we will see more sophisticated tools and techniques that will enable both honest, public, interested people to more easily create useful information and possibly more easily to create false information. And so there seems to be a lot of evidence that artificial intelligence techniques, AI techniques, which really are software programs that enhance the ability of our computer systems to create meaningful statements, that these meaningful statements may look, or images, may look increasingly real, so-called, and increasingly persuasive. And that is going to further deepen the challenge. I would say this, that it's interesting that you see a movement in the United States to reduce the time young people spend on the computer, the network, the notion of a digital Sabbath. You don't see, even in the absence of solutions, you do see some pushback by Americans about how much time they should be interacting on the web. And so I think, but no question that whether it's the chatbot or other tools around images, we're going to have an increasingly difficult time in believing what we see on the web and in understanding what we read on the web. Now, as Karen, who I think believes in the dream of this global town hall, that's Gresham's law. So that's bad money drives out good. At a certain point, if a platform becomes so adulterated, people will abandon it. Platforms get abandoned all the time. And we don't need to go through the litany, MySpace, the 8-track tape, CB radio. We can go on and on and on. These platforms could be abandoned too. And in that sense, Facebook is correct. Sure, they look like a monopoly, but they could die any day. And Twitter, to me, is an example of a death spiral. They're in a death spiral. And so we're not stuck with these. If the information gets too adulterated, even the common carrier model comes under stress. Google does not want, listen, why has Google resisted? Now, one reason is their search model is very advantageous. You search, you pick things, you, the human mind, your preferences. I don't believe people are going to tolerate answers rather than search links, because the answers are going to be adulterated too often. Remember, you don't have to have 100% bad answers. Most of us have had the experience of going to a restaurant or even dating someone. You have 2 or 3 bad dates in a row, you're thinking, maybe this is a bad idea, getting involved with this person. So I just think that what we think of as negative indicators, you don't need 100%. You don't need 50%. You get 1 in 10, 1 in 5, you start to say, you know what? I don't trust this anymore. I can't take the chance. So this is a treacherous time for everyone. And one of the things that, in his life, Steve Jobs and I fought a lot. I reported on him for the Wall Street Journal. He was at Next. The last words he said to me was screaming the words, "I'm not a failure." He had become somewhat concerned that I thought he had failed. I don't know why I had that idea, but you know, the legacy of Jobs we now see, the closed Apple world, you have a lot of advantages. Now, not everybody, of course, is comfortable with, oh, you can't change your battery, or you can't do this, or you can't do that. I actually like it. I think it's great that the App Store doesn't have pornography or doesn't have, you know, Nazi memorabilia for sale. I mean, they do a really good job of maintaining the integrity of their system, but it comes at a price, obviously. It's a more costly system. And there's some people who feel it's, you know, the Apple system is tyrannical. You know, nevertheless, what they did with the ads, to undercut Facebook's ability to follow you around, you can see that, hey, people liked it. So I do think that there may be a big financial win, a big market share win for a platform that can solve this problem mostly. And so we have a market response to this. It's not purely a government problem to solve. The market may solve this. And you know, we will see. But I think that's a positive possibility, because American ingenuity, the ingenuity of Silicon Valley, maybe they can come up with some kind of BS detector that's embedded in their platform that moves us along, moves us further along. I've got to think that's in there, because these are people too. I mean, most of them are very wealthy people. I was fortunate enough to know some of them, and they're not happy. No. They are not happy, because they didn't want to be the evil boogeymen that ruined the world. I don't want to start naming names of folks, but they have an interest in solving this. It's not as if they don't have children, they don't have friends, they don't live in communities, and they know that there's a big prize that will go to the companies, to the engineers that can figure this out, whatever it is. But it's not, to me, it's similar to the airbag situation. It's a safety feature that ought to be designed into our systems. It's just much more difficult.
Wonderful. Thank you, Greg. Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our time together. I did want to give the audience one last chance to submit any questions. And also you, Greg and Karen, any opportunity to add any last comments or statements before we close out today?
I would add one thing on the question, not just of Chat GPT, but something Greg touched on, but I think needs extra emphasis, is that the AI tools and the kind of the rise of AI, first of all, we're already used to seeing it in our word processors. We're used to seeing it in customer service chat online, where they start out with, kind of canned scripts. These things all come from humans. Humans are the basis of everything that we consider artificial intelligence. So whether it's picking the large data sets that an AI system will train on, or whether it's automating a sort of generic help text or something like that, it's humans that are behind them, and that is why I think they are fixable and trainable in ways that can be better than some of what we're concerned about. This is why there's been hue and cry about, for example, image sets that only include white people, for example. Well, we have other image sets, like we can work to have better data to input into these systems that's smarter, that's more reflective, and so on. But it is humans. We sometimes tend to think, well, this is something some technological monolith is imposing upon us. But it's really, we do have solutions and fixes and better approaches within ourselves that we can impose upon those systems.
That's a great point. And I just want to thank Karen and Bailey for putting on this wonderful event and maintaining our focus. I will just point out that in support of what Karen is saying is that lag and catch up. The lag effects are undeniable, but we can catch up. And I think that it's a good sign that we are subjecting this realm to scrutiny and intelligent critiques, because those folks are listening. Things can get better, and they will. So it's that gap between where we are today and where we'd like to be. But no question that if digital platforms are routinely supplying unreliable information, those platforms will cease to have much use. So we have to work with them, and they have to work to manage the problem better. But thanks again for listening to me. G. Pascal Zachary is my authorial name, and I'd be happy for you to look at some of my work in addition to this topic.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Karen. I think that was a wonderful sentiment to end us on today. I also want to thank everyone who joined us. The Paul Gray Personal Computing Museum appreciates your time, questions, and contributions. I do want to remind folks, this is an ongoing speaker series, so look out for our next event in a couple of months. You can also find this recording and previous recordings on our website, which you can find the link in the chat. I am also posting the link to a quick survey. If you could help the museum out by providing your feedback, we'd really appreciate it. And finally, one last plug. If you enjoyed this program and hope to see more, I do encourage you to consider donating to the museum. That link is also in our chat. So on behalf of the museum, I want to thank you all for joining us. I want to thank Karen and Greg, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.